I mentioned the United States, but there's it's going on elsewhere as well. So throughout South America, there's a number of groups have come here recently from Mexico, from Honduras, from Bolivia, and talked with the all-party groups about the revulsion they have for the drug state and the terrible effect it's had on their country. Where they were the producers, but the problems were in downtown Chicago, the consumers were the other side. And the most serious problems of drug trafficking and warfare involved those people in South America. There's been one major benefit for those states that are bordering, particularly Mexico, bordering the United States, where they've seen the control of drugs being taken into the hands of the state, and there's less trafficking, there's less drugs going across the border, which would be another benefit that will take place. Yes, of course.
Yeah, no, my honourable friend described some quite exotic places that are exotic to me, but I just wanted to give him an example from RISE, which is the Recovery and Support Service in Ealing, in my constituency. They're a drug and alcohol support service. The point they put to me is often these things are about working smarter, not harder. So maybe not necessarily being punitive, but looking at joined up thinking with other agencies. So I mean, in their case, they have a joint working initiative to reduce harm with West London Mental Health Trust, because they report that some varieties of this drug, particularly skunk, the strength of them is higher than was 10 years, 20 years ago. So they have joint risk assessments, wraparound treatment, they have database sharing and information with other agencies. So would you agree that that is a good way forward?
There's been a great deal of good work done by the agencies and those who work in this area. But the previous MP who ran the all-party group on drug misuse in this country did point out that there is a sort of establishment of people who are involved and have a vested interest in drug prohibition. And he went every year to a group of people who were helping out with drugs, but he noticed that in the 15 years in Parliament, there were more people came every year. So I think we have to say, yes, there's great work being done, and it always will need to be done to rehabilitate people who are afflicted by drug addictions. And yes, one accepts the work that's happening, but what is taking place in this country and throughout the world has been through all those 45 years of prohibition and increased use, a hugely increased use. It's going down now because of the matter referred to by the chair, the thing. Young people, it's fashion that does it, that young people are obsessed with a new addiction, which is playing with their iPhones and their iPads. They don't have time to produce a reefer, to roll one. And this is the new addiction that's taking place. I mean, it has a beneficial effect. It may be a new addiction, it probably doesn't do much harm, but that's the fashion throughout the world. And as we look at what happens, and the Home Office have admitted this, that there's no correlation between harsh punishments, harsh penalties, and the use of drugs. It's entirely to do with fashion and what young people regard as being acceptable, what they regard as being naff. But we imagine that we can control what's going on. We don't. The whole process is out of control. Holland gave us a fine example of the last 40 years in that they've depenalized the cannabis use, and there, now, and for all the last, nearly all of that period, cannabis use in Holland is far less than it is here in the United Kingdom. And there's a good reason for it. That if you're in Holland, you can go across to any of their coffee shops and have a cannabis cake with your grandmother. I mean, where's the fun in that? Because what they've taken away is the allure of forbidden fruit. In America, they sent groups of young former hippies out to the sticks to deter drug use. And at that time, drug use was rampant in the cities, but not in the rural areas. So they went there and they gave this message with these attractive, long-haired hippies with guitars and saying we've been through degradation, We've been through hell. We've been through sexual orgies. It was terrible. For goodness sake, don't do drugs. And the message were, they're dangerous, they'll upset your parents, and they'll destroy your health. Rather forgetting the young people all know they're immortal anyway. Danger is an attraction, and so is upsetting their parents and establish their identity. And drug use followed the drug education program as surely as night followed day. 45 years of futile experiment that's now should come to an end. If we look at just one example of what's happened, because there were people in America who then suggested that if cannabis was decriminalized for recreational purposes, there were all kinds of consequences would happen. And we do know what's happened in Colorado and Washington, where decriminalization of recreational drugs took place a year ago. The disasters haven't happened. The evidence is there's been no spike in cannabis use among young people. There's been no increase in road fatalities. But what there's been, of course, is a large reduction in the criminal market because the state now runs 6... Yes, of course, yes.
So much, Mr. Evans, and I'm very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for prompting me to get to my feet again by mentioning Northern Ireland. That's so kind of you. The Honourable Gentleman, in response to my first intervention, referred to his trip to Dublin, but not to Northern Ireland. The Honourable Gentleman will be aware that cannabis is still illegal in the Republic of Ireland. So I would just like the Honourable Gentleman to give some attention to the thought that while it remains illegal in the Republic of Ireland, we have a very porous border. It's easy to move into Northern Ireland and therefore into the rest of the UK. So what would the Honourable Gentleman believe to be the impact of changing the status of cannabis in the UK but not in the Republic of Ireland?
It was a concern that was expressed, of course, about the Netherlands and other countries when they changed the laws that there'd be drug tourism that people will flock across, and there's been examples of it that do take place. But one hopes that the world is going to come to its senses in a gradual process. It is happening now, and that there can be some, they can have some laws that are synchronous and can work that way, as happens in many other ways. I mean, my trip to the Oireachtas was because I had a report. I was writing for the Council of Europe at the time, and I represented Great Britain rather than and the United Kingdom rather than the my own opinions on that. But what we saw in Dublin in the criminality was horrendous, and very similar, very much a replay of what happened in the 20s in America. And we still have yet to learn that lesson. But I'm reminded by one of the interveners again on our attitude in this place, because we've been talking about this for many years. I can remember, and I prize the memory, of one debate where the spokesman for the opposition and the minister in charge had to leave the debate because they couldn't stay for the full period, because they needed to go outside the chamber for a fix, because they were both tobacco addicts and didn't see any contradiction in denouncing the use of an addictive drug in the chamber for young people, but themselves being addicted to another drug. And I recall another, I won't mention names here, I can recall another Conservative MP saying to me, just can't understand it. Went to a prison, and my constituent told me that he wanted to get hold of some paracetamol for his toothache. And he was told, well, you can't get that until you go and see the doctor tomorrow morning, and you might be supplied with that. But made the point, I can go out of this cell now, and within 10 minutes, I can get heroin, I can get cocaine, and I can get, I think the chairman might well recall this story, I can get cannabis as well, because they were freely available. Can we persuade the government to face up to their abject failure that's taken place over this long period? I've taken longer than I intended on this, and I know that many other members here with a long history in this subject, and I particularly welcome the member for the Green Party and the members for the Liberal Democrats, who I read in my Guardian this morning, are going to take this up in a more serious way. And there's no party that's contributed more to this subject and the cause of reform than the Liberal Democrats in this House. And it's sad to see that a number of them lost out in the last election, particularly the member for Cambridge and the member for Lewis. But these are people who have perhaps been punished by the press and possibly by the public for having been caught in possession of an intelligent idea. But they deserve the credit of this House. I look forward to hearing what they say. But I shall conclude my remarks by giving you a story of one person, Elizabeth Bryce, who campaigned under the name of Claire Hodges. Sadly, she died in 2011. And Elizabeth Bryce led protest after protest here. She actually single-handedly convinced the Belgian government in 1998 to change their law on medicinal cannabis. And she was a woman who was extremely gifted woman. She was a producer on a television company. She was a classicist, and among her more bizarre achievements was that she translated the Noddy books into Latin, which I have a prized copy. But her story was one that I could quote, and I'm grateful for all the people who've written to me recently. There's no way I can do justice to the number of letters I've had or the number of submissions. But she wrote, "Multiple sclerosis is a cruel disease. You develop it when you're young and healthy, and slowly but surely you lose all your faculties, abilities, and functions. Nowadays you can expect to live your full lifespan, often until you're completely dependent. And of course this is a very depressing prospect. All the future seemed to hold was deteriorating health and no medicines that really worked. When I tried cannabis, the physical relief was almost immediate. The tension in my spine and bladder was eased, and I slept well. I was comfortable with my body for the first time in years. But just as important, I felt happy that there was something, after all, that could help me. It was as if a huge weight had been lifted from me. Cannabis helps my body relax. It functions and moves much easier. The physical effects are very clear. It's not just a vague feeling of well-being." On one of her visits to the House of Commons, she committed a serious crime. Out on the terrace, she asked for a cup of hot water, to which she added some green substance, and I'm sure the staff were curious about what these green specks were in the cup afterwards. But she'd taken herbal cannabis in the House of Commons. The law at the moment says she could have been put in prison for 5 years for that crime of seeking relief from a pain. Would anyone believe that that's a sensible law? That law is an ass. For so long, this House has been held back from having the full-scale reform by the...
House, no applause, please. The question is that this House has considered the e-petition relating to making the production, sale and use of cannabis legal. Right Honourable Peter Lilly.
Thank you, Mr Evans. It's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Member who's just spoken and who for many years and with great consistency has pursued his campaign on this front and has sadly not yet achieved his objective. Some years ago, members of the press went round, members of both front benches, and asked whether they'd ever consumed cannabis. I found I was one of the very few who'd never done so then and haven't since. And that may be why I've had a clear enough head that when looking at the evidence, I concluded that we need not just to decriminalise cannabis, but actually to legalise its sale and use. I duly wrote a booklet, still the definitive work on the subject, called Common Sense on Cannabis, available, I suspect, from the SMF or free on my website. advocating legalization. And I still believe it's the right policy. Now I want to explain why. I do so not because I'm an advocate of use of cannabis. As I say, I abhor the stuff and have never used it. I'm not an advocate except, I might add, for medical use. And I'm sure we could all agree that cannabis and derivatives of it should be made available for medical use when it can bring the relief which the honourable member has just described and which many of us will have heard about from our own postbacks. Even Queen Victoria allegedly used cannabis to relieve menstrual pain, and if it's a Victorian value, then surely it can be made more widely available. But there are practical reasons for wanting to move to legalization. First of all, attempts to prohibit the sale and use of cannabis have failed. It's readily available and widely used. Until recently, indeed I believe still, we've had a higher level of usage in this country where it's illegal than in Holland where it's legally available. Nearly 30% of citizens of this country have at some stage or other used cannabis, and few of them had any difficulty in obtaining it. So it's failed. And it's failed despite the fact that 80% of the effort on the so-called war of drugs goes on trying to prohibit the use of cannabis. If we were to provide some legal outlets for cannabis, this enforcement effort and the treatment effort and so on could be diverted to tackling hard drugs, which really do harm people, enslave people, and sometimes kill people. Thirdly, keeping a law on the statute books which is widely ignored and impossible to enforce effectively undermines faith not just in that law, but in law and the legal system more generally. And finally, it would deprive the criminal world of a large and lucrative marketing. And as the Honourable Lady for North Down pointed out, that's particularly important in Northern Ireland, where that market is exploited by gangs who are, by and large the IRA and other paramilitaries, who are likely to use that resource for the most odious and nefarious reasons. Now, those sort of arguments have led many to conclude that we should decriminalise cannabis. That's to say, we should no longer make it an offence to possess or to use the stuff, but it should remain illegal to supply or sell it. That is actually de facto the situation in some parts of the country. But I believe as a policy, it will be a mistake. And let me explain why. One of the key reasons used by advocates of prohibition is that cannabis is supposedly a gateway drug. They say that once people have tried a soft drug like cannabis, it awakens a desire for stronger drugs and leads them on to cocaine and heroin. So they must stop going down the slippery slope. There's no evidence for that at all. The truth is that it's only the criminalisation of the supply of cannabis that makes it into a gateway drug. Because cannabis users can only obtain it from illegal sources, they are forced into contact with the illegal gangs who will try to persuade them to move on to hard drugs as well. Prohibition of cannabis drives soft drug users into the arms of hard drug pushers. Only by providing some legal outlets for cannabis can we break the contact between cannabis users and those pushing cocaine, crack, and heroin. In my